Hi, how you doing? In this video, I'd like to make a little bit of a departure from what I've been doing recently and just tell you all about one of the greatest pugilists to live. This is the guy that's known as the father of boxing. To those of you that are interested, his name's Jack Broughton. Jack Broughton was born in 1703 in a small village not far from Cirencester, and he went on to do remarkable things. He left home at a very young age and took his sister with him because his father had turned to alcohol and was becoming quite abusive. So the two of them left, and he made a living supporting them both, working, doing manual labour at the docks in London. Whilst he was there, he realised that he was pretty good at fighting, and he ended up training with none other than James Figg at Figg's Amphitheatre. And he stopped working at the docks after that and made his living almost entirely from fighting. When Figg died in 1734, one of his students, a guy by the name of George Taylor, claimed the championship for himself. There was some debate at the time as to whether this was valid or whether Broughton should have it. In the end, the two of them fought. Broughton utterly destroyed Stevenson and took the championship for himself. But that's not just what Broughton did. Broughton was hugely influential. He was a kind and gallant man, and he was well spoken and surprisingly well educated, and he, by his behaviour and his demeanour, kind of drew in some of the more wealthy members of the gentry and made them much more amenable to supporting boxing. So he, in effect, started to create the fancy. And one of the ways he did this was by being an expert swordsman as well as an expert boxer. And Captain Godfrey, who was a keen supporter of boxing, brought a friend of his along and didn't tell Broughton who this was, and challenged them to fight with swords. And Broughton defeated him relatively easily, and it turned out that this was none other than the Duke of Cumberland. And at that point, the Duke of Cumberland became Broughton's main sponsor and elevated him from the ranks of your average boxer to an absolute superstar. But Broughton's main contribution wasn't through boxing skill, it was through his character as a man. He had a very long and drawn out fight with a guy called George Stephenson, not the steam engine man, a completely different person. The two of them fought for an awfully long time and both suffered terrible injuries. Broughton went away the victor of that fight, but Stephenson never recovered from his injuries, and a short time after the fight he died. During that time, him and Broughton had become quite close, and Broughton at that point was filled with remorse and said he was never going to fight again. He couldn't possibly do it. He didn't want to be responsible for anyone's death. But very quickly it became apparent that him not fighting wasn't actually going to change anything, and people were still going to fight and people would still die. So at that point, instead of saying I'm not going to fight anymore, he took it upon himself to introduce a new set of rules for boxing to try and prevent what had happened to his friend Stephenson from ever happening to anyone again. Because up to that point there had been no accepted rule set. Fighters agreed beforehand what was acceptable and what wasn't, and they fought to those rules. There was no general overarching rule set that said you can't do certain things. So in effect, pretty much anything went. Knee strikes, elbow strikes, kicking, purring, grappling, throwing, ground fighting, biting, they were all acceptable things. And Broughton decided that he would try and control that and introduce a set of rules. So what I thought I'd do, I've got a copy, and this is a wonderful little book. It's a 1970s, highly abridged copy of Boxiana by Pierce Egan. These are relatively easily to get hold of. If you see one of these, get it, they're great. And in it, we have Broughton's rules. And I thought it might be interesting if I were to read these rules to you. there are 7 rules, and well, let's start. Rule number 1, that a square of a yard be chalked in the middle of the stage, and every fresh set to after a fall or being parted from the rails, each second is to bring his man to the side of the square and place him opposite to the other until they are fairly set to at the lines. It shall not be lawful for one to strike the other. So this is quite an interesting thing. What he's done is he's created a square in the middle, a yard across, and that after any fall or somebody leaving the ring, they have to be brought back to that square and they're not allowed to be hit until they are back at that square. Number 2, that in order to prevent any disputes, the time a man lies after a fall, if the second does not bring his man to the side of the square within the space of half a minute, he shall be deemed a beaten man. And that's quite interesting, and this is one of the ones that really stopped some of the significant damage being done, because it basically meant that if your opponent couldn't get back up to that square within 30 seconds, they'd lost the fight. Previous to that, the seconds would try very hard to get someone back up, and it might take them several minutes to get someone back to their feet. Now at this point, somebody may be suffering from severe concussion, they may be carrying a lot of damage, and fighting again was exactly what was going to cause the long-term problems such as Stevenson happened. So the fact that we now only had 30 seconds meant that those people who were carrying more serious injuries or had taken more of a beating weren't able to come back up. But it's quite interesting, this concept of the square drawn in chalk on the stage. Now that's fine when you're fighting on a stage, which most of the fights were at this point. This was in 1743, I think he introduced these rules. And fights were done on stages either in pubs or in theatres as part of the entertainment. But over time, what happened is the fights took place outside. So instead of having a square drawn in chalk on the stage, people would actually scratch a line into the ground. And this became known as coming up to scratch. And if you failed to come up to scratch, you'd lost. Just a little interesting point. Rule number 3. That in every main battle no person whatever shall be on the stage except the principals and their seconds. The same rule is to be observed in by-battles, except that in the latter Mr. Broughton is allowed to be upon the stage to keep decorum and to assist gentlemen in getting to their places, provided always he does not interfere in the battle, and whoever pretends to infringe these rules to be turned immediately out of the house. Everybody is to quit the stage as soon as the champions are stripped or before they set to. And that's quite an interesting thing as well, because up to that point, fights could take place surrounded by people, and people could interfere in those fights. So what Broughton did with this rule is he effectively said, when people are fighting, you can't be there. The only person that can be there is the second, and the second was there so that at the end of the round, when people had a chance to sit down, they'd sit on their second's knee. The second would kneel, the fighter would sit on their knee, and that would give them a chance to rest. So the seconds are the only people to be there in championship fights. In other fights, Broughton was allowed to be there. And the reason that he said that is because at the time he was not only fighting, but he was also putting on fights and promoting fights for other people in his own venue. So obviously he's going to let himself be on stage. But let's move on. Rule number 4. That no champion shall be deemed beaten unless he fails coming up to the line in the limited time, or that his own second declares him beaten. No second is to be allowed to ask his man's adversary any questions or advise him to give out. So again, this is a really interesting thing. It means that not only can you win by beating your man, by damaging him so much that he can no longer come up to scratch, but also that the second can look in and say, my man's beaten, you've won. And that introduces another interesting concept that we still see in boxing today. If you throw in the towel, then you've declared your fighter to have lost. You effectively give in. And that was introduced to try and protect the fighters. And it was Broughton that introduced it, so that's quite an interesting one. Rule number 5. That in by-battles, The winning man to have 2/3 of the money given, which shall be publicly divided on the stage, notwithstanding any private agreements to the contrary. Okay, so we're talking about non-championship fights here, and this is just about dividing the prize money. That's fine. Obviously that doesn't really affect the fighters from a point of view of safety. Rule number 6. That to prevent disputes in every main battle, the principals shall, on coming on the stage, choose from among the gentlemen present 2 umpires, who shall absolutely decide all disputes that may arise about the battle, and if the 2 umpires cannot agree, the said umpires to choose a 3rd, who is to determine it. That's an interesting point. So clearly, at this juncture in 1743, we don't have a referee, we don't have somebody in there deciding who's winning and who's not. We don't have judges sitting around making points. What we have is 2 guys fighting until one of them can't fight anymore. And if there's a dispute, did somebody come up to scratch in time or not, then we've got 2 people already chosen from the crowd, 2 respectable gentlemen, to make that decision. And if they can't agree, then they have to agree on someone else to come up to make the decision for them. That's quite an interesting point. Obviously that led on to having an umpire within the fight itself, but at this point that wasn't the case. Rule number 7. That no person to hit his adversary when he is down, or seize him by the ham, the breeches, or any part below the waist. A man on his knees to be reckoned down. Now, rule number 7, out of 7, is the one that basically limits what you can do to your opponent. All the other rules have been to make sure that the fight happens in a way that's controllable, but this one is quite interesting. So no taking hold below the waist. Doesn't say you can't strike below the waist. It just says that no person to seize him by the ham or the breeches or any part below the waist. Now that's quite an interesting one. What it means is that you can't pick someone up. Doesn't mean you can't kick them. It doesn't mean you can't knee them. It doesn't mean you can't strike below the belt. That was something that was introduced significantly later. No person to hit his adversary when he's down. That's quite an interesting rule, because clearly up to that point that was acceptable. When Fig was fighting, when Taylor was fighting, pre-Broughton, and in the early days, fighting on the ground was considered just another part of the fight. So what we have here are a set of 7 rules that introduce not only the very basic principles of boxing safety. You can see how no hitting below the belt was a direct consequence of no taking hold below the waist, and this whole concept of a man on his knees to be reckoned down, and that man then having 30 seconds to come back up to scratch, effectively introduced the concept of rounds in boxing. And obviously later on, when new, more stringent rule sets were introduced, the concept of rounds was much more strict, and you'd have timed rounds with a timed break. But at this point, you simply fought until a man either left the ring, went through the rails, or was down. So whether a knee touched the ground or the man hit the ground, that was considered to be the end of the round. And at that point, you had 30 seconds. As a rule, that was introduced to try and protect the fighters. But as we saw later on in this pugilistic era, within the Broughton's rules era, that was a rule that people could abuse. I'll tell you more about that in a later video, but for now, that was Jack Broughton. And what Jack Broughton did was revolutionise boxing. He wasn't the first champion, that was Fig. But what Broughton did was take boxing, make it acceptable and bring it into the mainstream. And for that, he should be known as the father of boxing. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. Please go along to pugilism.org. Check out the website. There's all sorts up there. If you're interested in the pugilistic era, there's stuff there. I've recently set up a special offer. You can get annual membership to the site at a massive £147 off. It's £50 if you use the discount code annual50. When you check out, select annual membership, go to the checkout, type annual50, annual50, all one word, in as a discount code. it'll knock off something like 75% of the price, and you can get in and see all of the videos, all of the documents, all of the original books, all of the ebooks, everything for a whole year. And well, it's fantastic. Please go check it out. Bear in mind there are only 20 of these vouchers and several have already been used, so you'll have to do it relatively quick. Anyway, check out the videos. If you haven't subscribed, please do. I've got something really special when I hit 10,000 subscribers. It's going to be a little while, but it will happen. And there'll be some more videos coming about some of the other great names in boxing and some of the things that they achieved, and some more fight breakdowns and all sorts of other stuff. Anyway, take care. I'll see you soon.